It's the most famous, unfinished, and unreleased pop album in rock history. More ambitious than the Beatles' Get Back album, more mysterious than First Rays of the New Rising Sun by Jimi Hendrix, and for the Beach Boys, the shelving of their 1967 album SMiLE may have altered the course of their entire career. Over the years, some of this music, like the track we just heard, Wind Chimes, has leaked out on either official Beach Boys albums or on hundreds of bootlegs. But it wasn't until 2011 that the average music buyer got to hear this adventurous music via the SMiLE Sessions box set from Capitol Records. So, is it a long-lost masterpiece? A mess of musical ideas? A bit of both? Well, joining us today is an old friend of the show, David Beard, host of the Good Vibrations podcast and editor of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine, for the first of a multi-part discussion about the Beach Boys album, SMiLE. David, welcome back to the show, and would it be fair to say that the road to SMiLE really begins with the song Good Vibrations?
Well, yeah. I mean, Brian began recording Good Vibrations in February of '66, and as you know, and I think as most people know, it ended up taking him until September to really kind of finally master that and have it where he wanted it, and then mix it down and have it released on October 10th of '66. The road to SMiLE is Brian Wilson's artistic journey towards a different aesthetic in the creative process. By this time, summer of '66, Brian was, and I don't mean this tongue-in-cheek, he was both peaking as an artist, but he was probably also peaking on LSD. By this time, he was working on Wind Chimes. He was working on Good Vibrations. Now, think about this for a minute. Wind Chimes is one of the first SMiLE-era recordings he starts to work on, and Good Vibrations. What do those things have in common?
They're in sections like little symphonies.
Yeah. I mean, there's the aesthetic we're talking about. What you have with SMiLE, the album, what you have with Heroes and Villains, part 1 and 2, and then what became the ultimate single, Condensed Down, is exactly what you had with Good Vibrations. Brian, with Good Vibrations, got into a tinkering mode and was not happy until he was done tinkering with it and had it just how he wanted it. And once he had it just how he wanted it in that 3 minutes and 35 seconds and then released it and went to shot right to number 1, he said, that's it. That's my formula. That's how I'm going to work from now on. It did take me a long time. It did cost a lot of money, but look at the results. So what Brian did with, and this is important, so we're going to use Good Vibrations as the example here because everyone knows it.
Right.
And a lot of people may know Heroes and Villains, but it's important to understand from Good Vibrations is 6 sections stitched together with recurring themes in it. It's actually called rondo. Right. It's a rondo format of recording where you have a reoccurring theme within a theme. So with Heroes and Villains, you have this song that the bicycle rider portion is this, and you'll hear it, is the din, dun, what's the melody? It's right. Heroes and villains, just see what you've done. Now that you'll also hear that played separately as the dun 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 dun. It's the same melody line, but when it's just the instrument, it's the bicycle rider.
So when Brian called SMiLE a teenage symphony to God, he wasn't kidding. And musically, he's stepping away from anything the group had ever done or sounded like in the past.
Right. SMiLE is like, I mean, Good Vibrations, the song is, I think it's safe to say, is an avant-garde recording and song. SMiLE goes beyond anything anyone has heard. It's like the Beach Boys suddenly becoming an exotica group.
Exactly.
It's all avant-garde. It's with rare exception. There's a couple kind of just straightforward. I mean, because even Heroes and Villains is avant-garde. It's like if you were to go to a show to see a barbershop quartet, and they were all high. I mean, that's what it sounds like. I mean, yeah.
You know, I think about something that Brian wrote in the liner notes for the SMiLE Sessions box set in 2011. He said, music is God's voice. I've often felt that I was on a musical mission to spread the gospel of love through records.
Yeah. Brian was really, really focused on creating music that actually represented something more than just what the listener got from it. So Good Vibrations was a song that Brian really wanted people to pick up good vibrations from when they listened to it, that they felt good inside from the aesthetic that the song provided. And that, to me, is what SMiLE is. One of the earlier tracks that Brian worked on was Our Prayer, initially just called Prayer, and before that they just didn't have a title. It ended up being the opening track for the album. Even though SMiLE never came out, they thought of it as like the Beach Boys' prayer for the listener, to kind of be elevated with them. Again, this is a different aesthetic.
Okay, this is the intro to the album.
We're talking to David Beard, host of the Good Vibrations podcast and editor of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine, about the Beach Boys' unreleased album, SMiLE. And we've danced around the song Heroes and Villains, and let's really get into it. And let's talk about what was happening and who Brian was collaborating with.
Yeah. By this time, he's met Van Dyke Parks, and Van Dyke is a real Svengali of word usage. And yes, it's true that at that time, just as most, not everybody, but most people of their ilk, their creative ilk, they were, smoking marijuana and hash and dropping LSD and experimenting with drugs like they were experimenting with music. That was common at that time in music history. I mean, we've read about it and we've been shown that.
Right.
I mean, that's been covered. But Van Dyke talked to Brian, similar to what Brian had done with Tony Asher. They sat down, they talked about what they wanted to do. Van Dyke, he wants to tell the story of the Old West. He wants to talk about the building of the Continental Railroad. And the discussion was, do you want to undertake this task of telling the Americana story using the Beach Boys as the platform?
Right.
To which Brian said, yeah, I do. But there's also, for those who know their American history, there's a lot of not so great history. And Van Dyke wanted to get into that too.
And let me say this, I'm not one of those people who thinks that every lyric Van Dyke wrote for SMiLE is genius. I think some of it is a little too precious for my taste. I mean, that's just my personal opinion. But I think the lyrics to Heroes and Villains are on point. I think he knocked it out of the park. The opening line, I've been in this town so long that back in the city I've been taken for lost and gone and unknown for a long, long time. That to me is like the best of beat poetry.
Yes, it is, and that's a good thing to note. Van Dyke, I think, in his own way, was very much a beat writer. That's what really makes it unique stuff. It doesn't roll off the tongue that easy. That's another beauty about these recordings, is that Brian took these really unique lyrics and forged them into Beach Boy harmonies. That's, I think, why everyone became so upset that SMiLE didn't come out, because it was so many really cool and interesting things. Heroes and Villains was the first song that Van Dyke and Brian tackled together. And it was kind of an overview of our society. The basic underlying statement being there's good people and there's bad people. But there's a personal message in there, too. Similar to I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, I think Heroes and Villains hold some sort of very special meaning to Brian, and I really don't know if anybody knows what it is. Except that maybe he had become, by his experience with Capitol Records, by the experience of the way the guys were appreciating his music, the way that Pet Sounds didn't do so well in the U.S., that maybe his disillusionment was coming into play. And I hear that in Heroes and Villains.
I've been in this town so...
We just heard Heroes and Villains Part 1 from the SMiLE Sessions box set. In just a few short minutes, we'll listen to Part 2 of Heroes and Villains. But first, we want to take a break here and mention to you that I have a pair of tickets to see Brian Wilson, along with fellow Beach Boys Al Jardine and Blondie Chaplin, performing Pet Sounds. Now, these are the final performances this year, playing the whole album in its entirety, and it's happening at the NJ Pack in Newark, New Jersey on April 28th at 8 p.m. I'll take a random caller at 201-692... We're talking with Endless Summer Quarterly's David Beard about the Beach Boys' unfinished album, SMiLE, from 1967. And we just heard Heroes and Villains Part 2, not to be confused with the single you might know of Heroes and Villains. And you also may have noticed that that appeared to be a sequence of musical ideas edited together with the Heroes and Villains melody popping in and out. And David, I have to admit, this is where I start to get really confused.
This is why SMiLE got too difficult. This is one of the reasons. It took Brian, 6 months to do one song that lasted 3 minutes and 35 seconds.
Right.
Okay? So now he's trying to do that in an album format and do it within a year's time. Well, if one song that took 3 minutes and 35 seconds took 6 months, what makes anybody think he's going to be able to knock out an album like that in anything under 2 years? But they don't know that. See, nobody knows that's what he's doing. Brian was on such a creative roll that if he woke up one day, and the day before he had been working on, let's say, Heroes and Villains, but the next day he woke up and he had just gotten a wild hair of an idea that, I want to go write this. I have this crazy idea about the Plymouth Rock. And this is a play on words. Rock, roll, Plymouth Rock, roll over.
Right.
Brian is freewheeling at this point. Drug use, maybe, but it's even the stuff that's just little pieces is pretty, as far as I'm concerned, incredible. But because they're incomplete, because they're not coherently finished, they suffer from that.
So we just heard two SMiLE cuts back to back. Do You Like Worms, subtitled Roll Plymouth Rock, and the song Holidays, the former missing some of the lyrics and the latter with no lyrics recorded for it at all. David, what's the story behind these two songs, and how come we don't have the Beach Boys singing the full lyrics to these?
Plymouth Rock, was the Pilgrims landing and taking it from the Indians.
Right.
So the Hawaiian experience, the Holidays, was from Van Dyke's standpoint. I would suppose that his perspective was how Queen Liliuokalani had to surrender her island to U.S. forces. And the idea of what Van Dyke wanted to tell, and tell it in the sardonic tone, tongue inserted firmly in cheek way that he wanted to, was problematic for the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys were a white group. And I can certainly see from any one of the group members to say, okay, so we're singing about how white man took the land from the Indian?
Right.
And now we're singing about how the white man took the land from the Hawaiians? I don't know, as a white man, if I'm comfortable doing this, because it makes me seem like I'm endorsing the behavior. And I could see how I would be uncomfortable with that.
And I remember Van Dyke Parks at some point saying, boy, what a great vehicle the Beach Boys would be to tell that story, because they were the all-American group. Exactly.
And I get it. I think it would have been an incredible, depending on your perspective, it would have also been very much a kind of the Beach Boys kind of standing up and saying, hey, we sing about this and we sang about this and we did this because we think it was wrong. And now we're bringing attention to it to so that people understand what was done. And so that's kind of a stance that you could say, well, okay, I get it. I'll get behind that. But the perspective could be, if you're a Beach Boy fan and you hear that, you might take it the other way.
But you could also have been a Beach Boy fan in late 66, early 67. Let's say, hypothetically, this album comes out. You're listening to it, and you could be a Beach Boys fan who says, I don't want to hear these guys singing about...
Well, exactly, because you're putting on a record, a Beach Boys record, that has a cartoon cover. It's probably going to be released around, if it's spring or summer 67, because I think originally it was January 67, then April or May. So let's say you go into the store, it's May, blah, blah, blah. You see it, oh, wow, looks cool. You get it, you go home, you put it on, and it's one song after another, taking U.S. history and putting it up against the dartboard and throwing darts at it. And it's interesting. It's adventurous. It's all these really great creative things.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's all of those things. And if that's all SMiLE was, maybe you could tell that story. But there's so much other stuff going on here. I mean, later we'll talk about vegetables and, barnyard and jumping in the pig pen and things like that. And I mean, it starts to become, to me anyway, very convoluted, just the whole concept.
Well, three things were basically with Brian is working on, I got to communicate the feel. I've got to get out whatever the song's about. I want the listener to experience it on this other level, this level of where they feel it, where they listen to it, if they put headphones on or whatever it may be. I want them to experience. If it's wind chimes, I want them to experience wind chimes. If it's good vibrations, I want them to experience good vibrations from the love that I'm putting into the song. Whatever it is, he's wanting more. And so Van Dyke comes along and says, I want to tell this tale. Brian says, cool, that sounds neat. And in the meantime, Brian was also into a humor bag. Brian was wanting to make people laugh. So he wanted... Because he gave everybody as much love as he felt he could give with pet sounds and good vibrations. That was his love. So now SMiLE was, let's listen to the title. He wanted to make people laugh. And if you don't have the SMiLE sessions, it is available on iTunes, the box set. There's portions of sessions that the Beach Boys are on tour, and it's just Brian with people in the studio with him, Van Dyke being one of them. And it's just a recording of them for 30 minutes just goofing around. And it's nothing. And it's like, well, I guess this is interesting because we get to hear it.
Right.
If you were ever young and recorded yourself and goofed off with buddies, that's about the equivalent of what it is. But we're talking, this is Brian Wilson, this is Van Dyke Park, so this has value. And I suppose that's a fair statement. But they really didn't go anywhere. None of the humor-based stuff really went anywhere.
Yeah, let me just jump in here, because this sounds to me like Brian was fixated on some really cool musical ideas, but the focus was getting away from him. I mean, maybe he should have just had 3 separate albums. Here's the American Gothic Trip with Van Dyke Parks, and this is my comedy album here. It just seems like he's really losing focus.
Well, the fact that SMiLE did not happen when it was supposed to happen speaks to an inability to complete the project. And it's been my perspective that was due to focus. But as full of creativity as SMiLE is, to my ear, it would take more than one person to sit down and work through that stuff to make sense of it. And I'm not talking about the finished pieces. It's not hard to make sense of the finished pieces. One of the things that Brian got off track with was the Element Suite, which ended up being his cross to bear, because he did not know how to finish it. And that was at that really critical point in the SMiLE story where he transitioned out of SMiLE and it became too much to piece together.
I'm going to tell you something. When I was a teenager, I got the SMiLE bootlegs on cassette, and they blew me away. And I loved all of it, all of the fragments, all of the little ditties that lead into other little fragments. And this was the Beach Boys stuff I would play to people if they thought the Beach Boys weren't cool. I'd say, well, forget Pink Floyd or the Doors. This is the real psychedelia here. But I have to admit, as I've gotten older, as much as this music defined me when I was younger, as I've gotten older, I love the finished songs like Surf's Up and Wonderful and Cabinessence, but I just can't connect at all with the whimsical fragments. I mean, fun to hear every once in a blue moon, but they just don't do it for me anymore. And maybe that's got more to do with me than the music.
Well, I think so. I think, I relate to some of what you said. As I'm older, I listen differently, I guess. I think I appreciate the art more than I do the humor now.
Right.
But everyone's different. When I discovered, full disclosure, when I discovered SMiLE, I was a young man in my early 20s. I was going to broadcast school at the time. I discovered SMiLE. I couldn't get enough of it, and I was someone who got high at the time, and I loved it.
Right.
I loved it. It was an integral part of my listening experience and my and my growth as someone who appreciated music. I couldn't believe how inventive it was. I could not believe that I wanted to listen to it as much as I wanted to listen to the Doors, as much as I wanted to listen to Pink Floyd, as much as I wanted to listen to the Moody Blues, because it was so different, it was so unique, and it had all those things. I had all the sessions. So I was listening to George Felder's French Horn. I was listening to Do You Dig Worms? I was listening to the finished pieces as well as these little brilliant things that were part of something but never were completed. And to this day, I still say that SMiLE is one of the greatest artistic achievements in a recording studio that anyone has ever undertaken. Would SMiLE have been a hit record in terms of album charts? I don't know. Nobody can say. But I will say this. Just like Pet Sounds, the music would have inspired recording artists around the world, and it would have changed music for that reason. It's the type of music, when you listen to it, you go, wow, listen to that. Listen to that potential. I didn't know you could do that. What Brian did with the technology of the time within the studio framework surpassed anybody, and that's why I still say when I listen to the SMiLE material, I still feel like it's the best stuff ever recorded by anyone, even in some of the fragments. Because what they had to work with in 1966, 67, and that Brian achieved what he did, even though he didn't complete the album, put the album together, what was recorded and how it was recorded, the way that it was recorded, and what was achieved is still something to be marveled at.
Well, we'll get into this, I'm sure, in upcoming episodes, but I think that there was enough material recorded that was finished and good that you could have had something come out, but that'll be that's a different conversation, and it's a frustrating conversation because things could have been very different.
Yes, what did happen in its place was got its own reaction. Yeah. But again, I absolutely 100% believe if SMiLE had come out, it would have been immediately gobbled up by all the artists out there, like all the Beatle members,
right,
all the Grateful Dead members, the Doors, you name it. They would have gobbled it up, and it would have changed music. Art lasts. Art lasts. People go into art museums because art is hanging on the wall. Art prevails. So I solely believe that and that's why SMiLE sessions came out in 2011, because it wouldn't go away. I recently heard a 1973 interview where the Beach Boys are being asked about SMiLE.
Right.
I've heard a 1976 interview where the Beach Boys are being asked about SMiLE. People would not let them up from the SMiLE conversation through their entire career. That's how relevant this art that never came out was to the world. That people wanted it even though it never came out. I mean, you would think, okay, maybe after a couple of years go by, it would no longer be on anybody's radar, that nobody would be talking about it. But that was hardly the case.
Even when they signed with Warner's, SMiLE was part of the deal, that they were going to turn that album
Exactly.
in. Yeah.
And they lost money because they signed the agreement.
Right.
But they still weren't sure how to present the art because it was so different and so unique. And so they, Heroes and Villains and Good Vibrations end up on Smiley Smile, Cabinescence and Our Prayer end up on 2020. Love to Say Dada, which was format into Cool Water, would end up on Sunflower. Surf's Up would have its own album in 71. I mean, the stuff never went away, and the Surf's Up album blew people out of the water.
Well, let's wrap up this portion of talking about the SMiLE album. We're really just scratching the surface here because there's so much to talk about, and we're going to have a part 2 to this very soon. But I want to shift gears in the remaining few moments that we have and talk about some things that are happening, not only with Endless Summer Quarterly, but also the Good Vibrations podcast.
Well, what Endless Summer Quarterly is trying to do right now is we are trying to put together 5 different editions. Now, Norman, because it is quarterly, that normally entails just 4 editions. And so what we're undertaking, what we're trying to complete, what we're trying to do, and not all the pieces have fallen into place yet, so we don't know. But we're the spring edition of Endless Summer Quarterly is going to center around Mike Love's work. He's got a solo album coming out pretty soon, as well as a tribute to the late Ricky Martin, who passed away last August of 2016. Right. And I've conducted interviews with Dina Martin, Billy Hinchy, Bobby Figueroa, and Carly Munoz. And actually, you can hear, that's a segue to the podcast, is the Good Vibrations of Beach Boys podcast is up on Mixcloud, but it won't be long before it's on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and Stitcher.
Right.
So I'll try to keep you up to date when those things when it gets up on those platforms. And I've interviewed Mike Love's book collaborator James Hirsch. I've interviewed Becoming the Beach Boys 61 to 63, Jim Murphy.
Yeah.
That's up there. Mike Love, of course, is up there. Dean Torrance is up there from Jan and Dean. Jason Brewer from the Explorers Club. It's Mark Lynette who puts all the Beach Boys projects together. Really fascinating stuff, and it's kind of my way to get out so the subscriber can actually hear some of the interviews, and for those who don't subscribe, they'd be able to kind of get a sense of the type of content that goes into the publication. And we're trying to do, Endless Summer Quarterly is trying to do, where we believe it's going to happen, a full-color edition of Endless Summer Quarterly that's separate from the subscription of just SMiLE. And it's going to, I can't go into much detail, but it's going to be full color, and it's going to be full of exclusives, and whether you subscribe or not, doesn't matter. It's going to be special order only, and it's going to be pretty interesting. So that's kind of underway, but the summer edition of Endless Summer Quarterly will be around the Smiley Smile album. The fall edition of Endless Summer Quarterly will be about their trip to Hawaii, Honolulu, and what eventually was an aborted live album. It's a whole nother story. And then the winter edition of 2017 Endless Summer Quarterly will be about Wild Honey. So those things are in place. And it's actually an interesting year because it's also going to be the 20th anniversary of a CD that I love called The Wilsons, that Carney and Wendy Wilson did with their father.
Oh, yeah, sure. Monday Without You was the single.
I've already conducted my interviews with Carney and Wendy. That'll be a podcast as well as content in an upcoming issue of Endless Summer Quarterly. And if people want to know where to find us...
I was just about to ask.
Just go to Facebook. That's the easy way if you're on Facebook. Just type in Endless Summer Quarterly and like the page if you don't mind. And the website is esquarterly.com, esquarterly.com. And when you get there, there's a jukebox that'll start playing music. And it's a pretty easy navigation. You'll see the cover of the latest edition on the right. And there's a palm tree that comes up from behind the jukebox. And at the very top, there's three signposts that are attached to that palm tree. The very top says subscribe to the magazine. If you click on that, it'll take you right to the page with all the ordering information.
All right, David, as always, thanks so much, and I look forward to continuing this discussion about the ill-fated SMiLE album in the very near future.
Thank you.